On a Wednesday afternoon in October of 2001, Mabel Eckert stood at the counter of her repair shop in Grundy County, Tennessee, and listened to a parts supplier in Nashville tell her, over a telephone that still had a cord on it, that the gasket set she needed for a 1974 Oliver 1755 would not be available. Not back-ordered, not delayed, not available. The man on the phone used the word discontinued, and then he used the phrase no longer supported, and then he said he was sorry, and Mabel thanked him, and hung up, and stood there looking at the Oliver, sitting on her shop floor with its head pulled and its block exposed, and a customer who needed it back by the first week of November to finish a soybean harvest in the lower fields. She did not say anything for a long time. There was no one else in the shop to say anything to. Let me tell you about Mabel Eckert, because you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she did next. Mabel was 52 years old in 2001, and she had been repairing farm equipment in Grundy County for 24 years. Not selling it, not delivering it, not writing service contracts for it. Repairing it on a property her grandfather had farmed before a bad knee and 3 bad harvests had pushed him toward town, and that her father had sold piece by piece over the years until what was left was a 2-acre lot with a cinder-block building and a gravel drive and a hand-lettered sign that said Eckert Farm Equipment Service, which is what Mabel had named it in 1977 when she was 28 years old, and had just come back from 2 years, working in the parts department of a Massey Ferguson dealer in Cookeville, and had decided she understood enough about what farmers actually needed to try doing it herself. Her father had not understood why she came back. Her mother had not said much either way. Mabel had spent the first 3 years of the business sleeping in the back room of the shop because the overhead on the building was $340 a month, and she could not afford both that and rent. She had a cot and a hot plate and a shelf of service manuals she had bought one at a time from a retiring mechanic in Altamont who sold his library for 25 cents a book at a yard sale. Mabel had bought all of it. 6 cardboard boxes of manuals, catalogs, and wiring diagrams covering agricultural equipment from the 1940s through the late 1970s. She had loaded them into her truck and driven home and spent the next 3 months reading them the way other people read novels, cover to cover, in order, not skipping to the problem sections, the way you read something when you understand that the context is the point. By 1980, she had moved out of the back room and into a rented house 3 miles down the road. By 1985, she owned that house. By 1990, she had added on to the shop twice and had more work than she could finish in a standard week, which meant she worked a non-standard week, which meant she worked until the job was done, and then she started the next one. The farmers who brought her their equipment were row crop operations, tobacco growers, cattle farms, a couple of nursery operations near Coalmont, and a hay broker named Ed who kept 4 balers running and seemed to break something on all of them in rotation. They were not wealthy people. The equipment they ran was not new. They drove Oliver tractors and Alice Chalmers tractors and Minneapolis Mullen tractors that had been purchased in the 1960s and 1970s and maintained through the 1980s and 1990s on the theory that a machine you own outright and understand completely is worth more than a machine you're still paying for and haven't figured out yet. Mabel understood this theory and agreed with it, which is part of why her customers kept coming back. The other part was that she fixed what she said she would fix, and she did it when she said she would do it, and she charged what she said she would charge. In Grundy County in the 1990s, this was not universal among repair shops, and the farmers who had been burned by someone else eventually found their way to Mabel Eckert, and they did not go anywhere else after that. She got her parts from 3 main suppliers: Two were regional distributors out of Chattanooga. The third was a smaller house out of Murfreesboro called Heartland Ag Parts, which was the only place she had ever found that reliably stocked components for the older Oliver and Minneapolis molding line. Heartland had been founded in the late 1950s by a man named Clyde Abernathy, who had farmed himself before a crop disease he couldn't identify and couldn't afford to fight had taken his bottom fields 2 years in a row and pushed him toward distribution. Clyde had believed that old equipment deserved old parts, and he had built an inventory that reflected that belief for 30 years. Clyde Abernathy died in 1997. His daughter sold the business to an investment group in Memphis in 1999. The investment group hired a new management team that spent the better part of a year auditing the inventory for profitability and then began, methodically, discontinuing the product lines that their models said weren't worth carrying. The letter arrived at Eckert Farm Equipment Service on a Monday in August of 2001. It was one page, printed on letterhead, and it informed Mabel that effective 60 days from that date, Heartland Ag Parts would be discontinuing 216 part numbers across their legacy agricultural line. Of the 217 part numbers, Mabel counted 81 that she ordered regularly. Regularly meaning at least twice a year, meaning that without them, there were families of equipment she simply could not service anymore. She set the letter on her workbench and went back to the Oliver she was rebuilding and thought about it. For 3 days before, she called Heartland's sales line and asked to speak with whoever was managing the liquidation. The man she spoke to was named Todd something. She could not remember his last name afterward, and he was polite in the way that people are polite when they have already made a decision and are simply administering it. He told her that remaining stock on the discontinued lines was available for purchase at cost plus 50%, and that the liquidation window closed in 30 days. Mabel asked how much inventory remained across the 81 part numbers she needed. Todd put her on hold for 11 minutes and came back with a spreadsheet summary. There was, depending on how she used the parts, somewhere between 2 and 5 years of stock remaining. Mabel asked how much it would cost to buy all of it. There was a pause. Todd had apparently not been asked this before. He came back with a number. It was $67,400. Mabel said she would call him back by Thursday. She drove home that evening and sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything she knew. What parts she used, how often, what the alternatives were, what would happen to her business if she couldn't source them, what would happen to her customers if she couldn't repair their equipment. She wrote for 2 hours. The legal pad was not dramatic. It was a column of numbers on the left and a column of notes on the right, and a total at the bottom that told her she needed to move fast. She called her brother-in-law, a man named Doug, who had once loaned her $8,000 when the shop's roof caved in after an ice storm. Doug said he could lend her $15,000, no interest, paid back when she could. She called Grundy County Savings on Thursday morning and spoke to a loan officer who had known her father and arranged a line of credit against the shop property for $60,000. She had never borrowed against the property before. She had never needed to. She called Todd at Heartland on Thursday afternoon and said she would take it. She rented a box truck. She drove to Murfreesboro on a Friday morning in September of 2001, loaded $67,400 worth of engine components, gasket sets, bearing kits, hydraulic seals, and PTO shaft parts into a truck she had rented from a U-Haul on the south end of town, and drove back to Grundy County with a truck full of parts and a note on her property and the distinct sensation of having done something that could not be undone. Her daughter Annie was visiting that weekend. Annie was 27 and taught school in Tullahoma and had her mother's eyes and her father's caution. She stood in the doorway of the shop on Saturday afternoon and looked at the pallets of boxed parts stacked along the back wall and asked, very quietly, if Mabel was sure about this. Mabel said she was not entirely sure, but she said it the way her father had once said things he was committed to regardless of outcome, which was with a flatness that did not invite further discussion, and Annie went back inside and made dinner, and Mabel stayed in the shop and started building shelves. Now let me ask you something, because I think it matters. Have you ever watched someone make a decision that looked like stubbornness from the outside, but was actually the most methodical thing they had ever done? Because that is what Mabel Eckert did in that truck on the way back from Murfreesboro. She had not panicked. She had calculated. She had 24 years of invoices in a filing cabinet in the shop, organized by customer, and then by equipment model, and then by year, and she knew her own usage patterns the way a farmer knows what his land will and won't do. She knew which parts she burned through and which ones she stocked as insurance. She knew exactly how long that Heartland inventory would last her if she rationed it against her manufacturing capability. Her manufacturing capability, as of September 2001, was not nothing. Let me tell you about what Mabel had in that shop, because the equipment is part of the story. She had a South Bend lathe from 1959 that she had bought from an estate sale in Pelham for $900 and rebuilt herself over 3 months in 1983. She had a drill press and a mill and a surface grinder that she had acquired one at a time over 20 years, always from closing shops or estate auctions, always at a fraction of replacement cost, always after inspecting them herself to determine what they needed and whether she could provide it. She had a hydraulic press she had assembled from parts she sourced individually because the assembled version cost 4 times as much. She had, in short, the tools of someone who had been quietly building a manufacturing capability for 2 decades without calling it that, because she had been building it for the same reason she built everything else, because she needed it, and it was cheaper to build it than to buy it. What she could not do on her own equipment was produce gasket materials in the alloy and thickness specifications that some of the older Oliver engines required. She could produce certain bearing sleeves and bushings on the lathe. She could produce PTO shaft components and hydraulic fitting adapters and valve stem guides. She could not, with what she had, produce gaskets that would hold to the tolerances of a 1960s Oliver head. She spent the 6 months after the Murfreesboro trip learning how. She found a gasket fabricator in Shelbyville that had been supplying a now defunct lawnmower manufacturer and that had a cutting die inventory going back to the 1950s. Some of their dies matched Oliver's specifications, not all. For the ones that didn't, she drove to Shelbyville 3 times in the winter of 2001 and 2002 and sat with the shop foreman, a quiet man named Al, who had been cutting gaskets since 1968, and they went through the Oliver service specifications together and identified where custom cutting dies could be made at reasonable cost. Al charged her a fair price. She ordered custom dies for 4 gasket profiles that she used most frequently. The dies cost her $3,200 total. She had them in hand by March of 2002. She found a bearing supplier in Huntsville that stocked metric and fractional blanks and could ship in 2 days. She found a hydraulic seal manufacturer in Knoxville that did small-run custom seals for industrial machinery and that did not require a minimum order that a shop her size couldn't meet. She built these relationships carefully, the way you build any relationship where you are the small account and the supplier has larger customers and you need them to treat your order with the same attention they give to the orders that are 10 times the size. By the fall of 2003, Mabel could manufacture, from raw materials, 53 of the 81 part numbers she had purchased from Heartland. Not close enough. exact. Machined to specification from her service manuals, fabricated to the tolerances that the original manufacturers had specified, using materials that met or exceeded the original material standards. The remaining 28 were components she could not practically make herself. And for those she had located sources, 2 specialty suppliers she found through a Farm Equipment Collectors Association newsletter, one retired parts dealer in Indiana who maintained a personal warehouse inventory of agricultural components as a retirement occupation, and a machine shop in Decatur, Alabama, that could produce low-volume cast components if she provided the drawings. She drew the drawings herself. She had learned mechanical drafting from a correspondence course in the mid-1980s because she needed to order a machined component from a supplier who required drawings, and she wasn't going to pay a draftsman for something she could learn to do herself. Let me tell you about the spring of 2004, because that is when the other calls started coming. There were, in the counties surrounding Grundy, perhaps 15 independent farm equipment repair operations of various sizes. Most of them were 1- or 2-person shops like Mabel's. All of them had received the same letter from Heartland in 2001. Most had bought what they could afford in the liquidation, which, for most of them, had been a partial supply, enough to get through the next year or two, and had spent the intervening years watching their inventory of legacy parts decrease to the point where they were declining certain jobs. The word that reached them about Mabel Eckert was specific. She had Oliver parts, she had Minneapolis Molen parts, she had Alice Chalmers hydraulic seals. Nobody quite knew how, but she had them, and she was willing to sell them. The first call came from a man named Gene Tully, who ran a one-man shop in Bledsoe County, and who needed a set of valve guides for a 1967 Minneapolis Moline G1000 that a dairy operation needed running before the end of the month. Gene had called everyone he knew. He called Mabel as what he later described as a long shot. Mabel told him to come by on Tuesday. Gene drove to Grundy County on Tuesday morning, and Mabel handed him a set of valve guides she had turned on the south bend from phosphor bronze bar stock that met the original specification. Gene held one up to the shop light and rotated it slowly and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How much?" Mabel told him. Gene said that was less than he had paid Heartland, and Heartland had been buying them from a manufacturer. Mabel said she knew. She had calculated her material and labor cost and added what she thought was fair. What she thought was fair was less than what a distributor charged, because a distributor had overhead she didn't have. After Gene Tully, there were others. Not many at first. 4 or 5 shops in the first season calling about specific parts for specific machines. But the calls kept coming, and Mabel kept answering them, and by 2006 she had a secondary operation running alongside her repair business, selling parts she manufactured and parts she sourced to independent shops across a 6-county area, and then beyond it, because word traveled and the area expanded. She kept her records in a 3-ring binder with dividers organized by equipment brand and then by component type. She had not built a website. She had not placed an advertisement. She had a binder and a telephone and a reputation that moved through the farm equipment community the way water moves through limestone, which is to say slowly and without announcement and in directions nobody planned. The irony, which Mabel appreciated without making much of, was that the investment group in Memphis had spent 2000 and 2001 running analyses on exactly this market segment and had determined it was not worth maintaining. What they meant was that it was not worth maintaining for an operation of their scale and overhead structure. For Mabel Eckert, working alone in a cinder block building on a 2-acre lot in Grundy County, with equipment she had bought from estate sales, the margins were fine. Better than fine. The secondary parts business by 2007 was generating more revenue than her repair work. She had not set out to build a parts supply operation. She had set out to keep her own shop running. Let me tell you about 2009, because that is when the equipment changed. Mabel had been watching her South Bend lathe struggle with certain turning jobs for 2 years. The machine was 50 years old, and she had rebuilt it once already and knew its tolerances the way she knew her own handwriting, which meant she also knew when it was approaching the edge of what it could reliably do. She needed a better lathe. She found one at an estate sale outside of Tullahoma, a 1971 Clausing engine lathe, 13 inches over the bed, with a threading attachment and a taper attachment, and a collet closer that the South Bend had never had. The estate was that of a retired machinist who had run a small job shop out of his barn for 30 years. His family had no idea what they had. The asking price was $3,200. Mabel drove to Tullahoma, inspected the machine for 3 hours, determined that it needed a new chuck and a lead screw cleaning and nothing else that mattered, and bought it. She spent 4 weeks getting the Clausing running right. Annie called during that period and asked what she was doing, and Mabel said she was rebuilding a lathe, and Annie said she had been saying that for 30 years, and Mabel said she supposed she had. When the Clausing was running, it opened up turning work she had been sending to a shop in Manchester. She brought it in-house. The Manchester shop called to ask what had changed. Mabel told them she had a better lathe. The Manchester shop's owner asked what kind. When she told him it was a 1971 Clausing, he was quiet for a moment, and then said those were good machines. Mabel said she knew. Annie got married in 2010 to a man named Curtis Belcher, who worked in agricultural lending at a bank in Nashville. Curtis was polite and organized, and had a talent for reading a balance sheet that Mabel did not have and did not want to develop. He visited the shop for the first time at Thanksgiving in 2010 and walked through it with the expression of a man trying to reconcile what he was seeing with a category he did not have for it. He asked Mabel how she tracked inventory. Mabel showed him the binder. Curtis said carefully that he thought she might benefit from something more systematic. Mabel said she had been thinking the same thing. Curtis offered to help. Mabel said she would appreciate it. What followed was 6 months of Curtis driving down from Nashville on alternating weekends and entering the contents of Mabel's binder into a computer system he set up on a used laptop he bought specifically for the purpose. Mabel watched this process with an attention that Curtis at first mistook for skepticism. It was not skepticism. It was the same attention she gave to any process she did not yet fully understand, which was complete and patient, and would eventually produce a judgment, one way or the other. The judgment came by the summer of 2011. The database told her things the binder had never been able to show her, which part families were selling faster than she was replenishing them, which customers were ordering more frequently, and what that suggested about their equipment inventory, which components she was making from scratch most often, and whether she should be stocking more raw material for them. She used this information to adjust her purchasing and her machining schedule, and the adjustment was measurable in the time she stopped losing to inventory gaps. Curtis, for his part, stopped thinking of his mother-in-law's shop as a curiosity and started thinking of it as a business, which it had always been, and which it became easier to see once the numbers were arranged where he could look at them. By 2014, Eckert Farm Equipment Service was shipping parts to shops in 8 states. Mabel had not sought this out. She had answered the phone, filled the orders, and shipped what she made to wherever the order came from. The geography had expanded on its own because the need existed, and nobody else was filling it. Annie came to work in the shop part-time in 2015 after her school's funding was cut and her position was eliminated. She had not planned this. She came initially to help with the shipping and the database and the correspondence, which had grown to the point where Mabel was losing 2 hours to paperwork that did not involve any of the things she was actually good at. Annie had her mother's organizational instincts applied to a different set of problems, and within a year she had the order fulfillment system running so cleanly that Mabel rarely had to think about it. What Mabel thought about was the machines and the parts, and the farmers who needed both. Let me tell you about the morning in April of 2023 when Mabel Eckert turned 74 years old, because that morning tells you what 24 years of building had actually built. Annie arrived at the shop at 7 and found her mother at the closing, finishing a sleeve bearing for an order going out that afternoon. The surface grinder in the corner was running a program Curtis had helped set up the previous week. The shelves along the back wall held components for 39 distinct equipment families across 5 decades of agricultural manufacture. There were parts in those bins for machines the original manufacturers had stopped supporting in the 1970s. There were components Mabel had turned herself on the South Bend, which still ran against the side wall as a second machine, and components she had sourced from the gasket cutter in Shelbyville and the bearing supplier in Huntsville and the retired parts dealer in Indiana, who had died in 2019 and whose inventory his son had sold off, much of it to Mabel, who had recognized what it was worth. Annie brought coffee and set it on the corner of the workbench and didn't say anything, because Mabel was in the middle of a cut, and interrupting a cut was not done in that shop. When Mabel finished and stepped back and looked at what the machine had made, she picked up the coffee and drank some of it and said they had a full afternoon ahead. Annie said she knew. Mabel looked at the shelves. Not with satisfaction, exactly. With the expression of a person reviewing the status of something that needs to keep going and is going, and they intend to keep it that way. The shops that called in 2023 were not the same shops that had called in 2004. Some of those original operations had closed. Their owners had retired or gotten sick or simply run out of parts they couldn't replace and had stopped taking certain jobs until there were no jobs left to take. The shops that called now were younger, run by people who had entered the trade after the supply chains had already dried up, who had never known a time when you could dial a distributor and have a piston ring for a 1966 Alice Chalmers D17 show up in a week. For them, Eckert Farm Equipment Service was not a fallback. It was the first call. The place you called because the person on the phone knew what you were talking about, and the part would be there or could be made, and the price would be what it should be. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story does not end with coffee on a Tuesday morning in April. In the summer of 2024, Annie's husband Curtis arranged a meeting with a farm cooperative out of Cookeville that had been struggling for 3 years to maintain a fleet of older irrigation equipment on 12-member farms. The equipment was a mix of brands, 1970s and 1980s vintage, and the cooperative's maintenance manager had been piecing it together with improvised repairs because the parts didn't exist anymore through any channel he had found. Curtis brought the maintenance manager to the shop on a Thursday afternoon. The man's name was Roy Hester, and he had been keeping farm equipment running for 30 years, and had the kind of eyes that look at machines the way some people look at old friends, with recognition and a slight worry about how long they'll last. Roy walked through the shop slowly. He stopped at the shelves and read labels. He picked up a sleeve bearing Mabel had turned that morning and held it the way Gene Tully had held that valve guide in 2004, up to the light, rotating slowly, checking the finish with a thumbnail. He set it down carefully and asked Mabel if she could supply parts for the specific irrigation pump models the cooperative used. Mabel asked him to send her the model numbers and whatever original documentation they had. Roy sent a package that arrived 2 days later. Mabel spread the contents across her workbench and spent an evening going through them. She recognized 2 of the pump families, had serviced one of them years ago for a tobacco farmer in the county who had run the same system for 30 years. She pulled her manuals. Of the components Roy had listed, she could manufacture 14 directly. 4 would require custom gasket dies. 2 would require sourcing cast blanks, which she could have poured in Shelbyville if she made the patterns herself. She quoted Roy a price and a lead time. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said the price was lower than he had expected. Mabel said that was because she wasn't carrying the overhead of a distribution network she didn't need, and because the materials were what they were, and because there was no reason to charge more than the work was worth. The cooperative became a regular account. The service manuals Mabel bought for 25 cents each at that yard sale in Altamont are still in the shop. She added to them for 40 years, and Annie has added to them since, and they now fill 2 4-drawer filing cabinets against the back wall next to the drill press. They are not digitized. They are paper in hanging folders with handwritten tabs, organized first by manufacturer, and then by model family, and then by year, and every person who works in that shop knows how to use them, which currently means Mabel and Annie, and a young woman named Bess Gilroy from the vocational program at the community college in Altamont, who came in the fall of 2022, asking if she could learn to run a manual lathe, and who is now, in Mabel's estimation, the best young machinist she has seen in 20 years. The South Bend lathe is still running. It has had a new lead screw and a rebuilt headstock spindle and a set of ways that Mabel reground herself in 2016 when the wear had gotten to the point where she didn't trust the tolerances. It is not the same machine it was in 1959 in the sense that most of its wearable components have been replaced. It is exactly the same machine in the sense that it does the same work to the same standard and has passed through hands that understood its value and kept it that way. The investment group in Memphis that bought Heartland Ag Parts was itself acquired in 2009 by a larger agricultural supply company that operates a national distribution network and focuses exclusively on equipment manufactured after 2000. Their online catalog returns no results for Oliver 1755 gasket sets or Minneapolis Moline G1000 valve guides or Alice Chalmers D17 piston rings. The search function works correctly. The parts simply are not there. The farmers who need them badly enough find out where to go. They always do. They end up calling a number in Grundy County, Tennessee, and they talk to Mabel Eckert or Annie Belcher or Bess Gilroy, and they leave with what they came for. And sometimes they ask how this shop has parts that nobody else in 4 states carries, and the answer is always the same. A woman drove to Murfreesboro in the fall of 2001 and bought everything that was left. And then she spent the years after that learning how to make what she couldn't buy. And she taught the people around her to do the same. And she kept the machines running that everyone else had decided weren't worth keeping because she understood that the value of a machine is not settled by whether a distributor's margin analysis says it belongs in the catalog, but by whether it does the work when the work needs to be done, and whether someone cared enough to understand it well enough to keep it doing that. There is no sign above the bay doors anymore. The old one rotted out in 2018, and Mabel never replaced it, because by then everyone who needed to find the shop already knew where it was.